Welcome, dear listeners, to another episode of Music and Politics, the only fusion show on the internet where we listen to music and think philosophically about politics. Every episode we turn to music to listen and analyze as a dimension of politics, to music as a political text, from tone poems to tropicalia, from gospel to grunge, and opera to hip-hop. From Thailand to Tallinn, from Soweto to Surabaya, and from Mumbai to Mobile, we traverse the world. And we guarantee, before you leave us today, you will have your eardrums a-tingle and your brain cells a-quiver with something new and unexpected you won't forget anytime soon. And please remember to rate and review and to like and subscribe to Music and Politics, and to support us on Patreon at Music and Politics Pod, one word. Any help at all is so very appreciated. It will keep us going, and in return, we pledge our personal attention and support to you in your learning. Happy and bold listening ahead. Welcome back to Music and Global Politics. Please like, rate, subscribe, and support on Patreon at musicandpoliticspod.com. Russia is a font of alternative perspectives usually unavailable in the West. With its strong Byzantine past, Russia arguably now still and forever remains an exemplar of Caesaorpapism, the subordination of the church and matters sacred inside the state, a strong symphony of church and state, lending the country's overall arc an air of the messianic. Let us remember the Eastern Orthodox Church genuinely considers the Catholic dogma of papal supremacy to be an ecclesiological heresy, though they accepted primus inter pares, or first among equals, for the Bishop of Rome in the early church. The claim of the Pope as supreme vicar of Christ on earth with infallible authority has never been endorsed. This background greatly shapes what is distinct about the Russian reception of the ever-popular, if controversial, German composer and father of the total work of art, Richard Wagner. If Wagner is seen as a problematic arch-reactionary, even a proto-Nazi, but looking out from Russia westward, if anything, Wagner has had a progressive role in musical aesthetics. His works challenged the old regime of the Tsars, and even the Soviet Union championed his work during and after the Nazi invasion. Our guest, Slava Vlasov, a passionate Wagnerian and author of much creative fiction based on Wagner, highlights how in his early career at least, in terms of his contacts and circles, Wagner can be seen as much a Russian composer as one German. In this episode, we discuss Wagner's Russian side, the controversy over his semi-sacred, mostly heretical Parsifal, Wagner's breaking open of the possibilities on the Russian stage, and how Wagner has been viewed by the Soviet Union and more recent post-Soviet Russia. Our conversation is enclosed by two lovely piano renditions of Wagner. The first, the quintet from the Master Singers of Nuremberg, and the second, the album Leaf for Duchess Metternich. Please enjoy and stay tuned for more. Thank you.
As you wish, you can call me Slava. That's my short name, and I'm okay with people calling me Slava.
Wonderful. Maybe you could, first of all, introduce yourself, explain something of your background, and even to the listeners, what is the meaning of Vyacheslav and Slava, and what is the difference between the two?
Okay, okay. So thanks, Adam. Just a few words about myself. I'm a writer. I write stories about Richard Wagner, and I'm a Wagnerian in a way. And then probably I'll tell you a bit more about my passion to Wagner a bit later. But Vyacheslav, that is the Slavic name that literally means the Holy Prince. And Slava is a short name from that. And in my language, it means glory.
Mm. And maybe you could continue by sharing somewhat of your background, how you first became exposed to music, and what brought you specifically to Wagner then.
Oh, thanks, Adam. I think you know me a little bit. I'm not a musician, although I graduated from the music school when I was a kid. And I'm not a musicologist. I'm a lawyer. For my entire life, I've been dealing with the international tax law, and Wagner was always sort of a hobby, and music was always sort of a hobby. And it's interesting that you ask him, how did I become interested in Wagner? I think I was about 24 years old then. Yes, it was back 1997. Tony Palmer at that time produced Parsifal at the Mariinsky Theater in Russia, in St. Petersburg. 80 years after the last time Russia held Parsifal. And I naturally came there. I didn't know the plot, I didn't know the story, I didn't know the music. I just came to see what's there. And I still remember this very strange impression because after the evening, for about a couple of months, the music sounded somewhere in my head. I don't know whether it was brain or it was unconscious or whatever, but it was somehow there, and I liked this music. And that was very strange for a boy who grew up on Russian opera, on Italian opera. And since then, I really started to learn more about Wagner. I wanted to know what was he and what was his operas. And I went to opera house, bought some records, listened to the music, and I started to read about Wagner. So over time, I've collected a library of all Wagner-related books that were ever issued in the Russian Empire, in the Soviet Union, and then independent Russia. And then listening to music, reading about the composer, somehow I had this feeling that it was very difficult for Wagner to get to success. And at the same time, I realized that there were so many books about his operas, about his music, biographies, musicological books, I would say. But there was nothing fictional to talk to him more about the man, about the personality, about the human being, and why he decided to compose exactly the music that we know. So I started to learn more and more about this. And that's how I got the idea to start writing stories about lesser known facts of Wagner. I remember, Adam, how we first spoke. That was some years ago. I don't know how you found my story about Wagner in Riga. You recall that?
Mm, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's sort of a type of stuff I started with, like Wagner in Riga, a bit fictional type of stuff. And then the next was story about Wagner tour in St. Petersburg, about his last months of life in Venice, about production of his operas in the Russian Empire. I even created a short biography of Wagner in alcoholic drinks. What did he drink and what he composed after that? So that after I retired from my profession, that became a substantial part of my life, and I still live this life. That's probably
That's
briefly about myself, Adam.
that's wonderful. Maybe we can post a link to your extremely entertaining an insightful short biography of Wagner in Drinks, so the readers can benefit and enjoy as well. To return back to what you mentioned, being exposed to the sound world of Wagner as something distinctive, and maybe you could share a little bit more about how Wagner sounded different from, let's say, the Russian operatic world. And maybe you could also share a little bit about like where in Russia this was, which opera houses, as we continue.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I can say from the very beginning now that Russian opera is more melodic. It has completely different structure. It's classical opera structure as you see in Verdi or in Puccini, or in Russian operas you have solos, duets, chorus, etc., etc. So Wagner is completely different. All of these recitatives and all these leitmotifs and never-ending story, and basically uh, voice is just one of the instruments of the entire orchestra in Wagner, unlike in the Russian opera, where voice is something that people go for. They go to the opera house to listen to the voice first. And where was it? I think I mentioned it was Mariinsky Theatre in St. Petersburg. And that's my city. And I think Wagner is more and more across the entire Russia now. But in St. Petersburg, you can hear almost all Wagner, except for Rienzi and his first operas like Band of Love or The Fairies.
And maybe you could continue by offering your understanding of why Wagner is still so significant for you personally, but also for audience more generally. What is it that's special about Wagner?
Well, thank you, Adam. I think if we talk about audiences or people in general, maybe it's worth asking musicologists or historians about that. But let me try. Let me try. First, if I can state some facts, I think we all know that almost every respectable opera house in the world has Wagner in its repertoire. The new Wagnerian productions, they come every year. Then houses are fully packed. Tickets are not that cheap. We all know that Bayreuth Festival is still going on, and any musician treats the engagement there as an honor. And that tells me there is a demand. There is really a demand for that music. And that maybe that's because these thoughts that Wagner put into his works in the 19th century, they're still relevant. They're still stimulating. Maybe his concept of music drama is still of interest to human nature. And if you look at how people perceive Wagner, it's either love or hate. There's nothing in between. And this was when Wagner was alive, and that is still the case. But maybe, if you allow me, Adam, I can add a few things as a writer who talks to my readers, who talks to audiences attending my literary and music events. What I notice is that people are also interested in Wagner's personal qualities, like his commitment, his diligence, his faith in own talent, his ability to cope with hardships and difficulties and challenges. And he had a lot of them in his life, with rejections, with misunderstandings. And that's what people like. And I think that deserves respect. And Wagner, in a way, can be a role model to anyone who wants to achieve something in their own field, even if his field is far removed from the music. And that's probably the other part of Wagner that attracts people still. And I always ask a question: did Wagner have a choice? Can he become a different composer? Can he create a different music? I think he did. He did. He could easily choose a different path and create lighter operas and more traditional type of music. And in a way, he could be successful and very rich man, but he made a choice to go a different path. And that also deserves recognition, I think. I think.
Excellent. And if we can move to talk a bit about the specific reception of Wagner in Russia and Russian history, bearing in mind, of course, that Wagner's really first significant career station was in Russia, was in the city of Riga, which at the time was in the Russian Empire.
Exactly.
And I know, of course, you've spent a lot of time researching Wagner's time in Riga, as well as the case of Parsifal in the late empire. So I'm wondering, it's such a vast history if we talk about the Empire, Soviet Union, and the Federation today. Perhaps we could begin by starting with the situation in the late Russian Empire and what was distinct about how Wagner was performed and understood, and even right subject to some form of political censorship at the
All
time.
right, all right, all right. Adam, if you allow me, I'll start from a different angle, if you don't
Okay.
mind. Because to understand the perception of Wagner in Russia, I think it's also important to understand that Wagner personally had many connections to Russia. And that was known. You have just quoted one fact from his life in Riga. Then he was a young boy, young man. So he created major part of Rienzi there, and he copied the design of a local German theater in Riga to his Bayreuth festival house. That's one of the facts. But if you look at Wagner as an individual, he didn't have that many close friends in his life, but he had lots of Russian close friends. Take this Russian revolutionary Mikhail Bakunin, whom together with Wagner took part in the Dresden uprising in 1848, if I'm not mistaken. So Wagner used Bakunin as a prototype for Siegfried in his Ring of the Nibelung. Then you can say that one of his most close friends was Alexander Serov, the Russian composer and music critics. And because of their close bonds, Serov advertised Wagner and his legacy very heavily in the Russian Empire. And he was a very well-known composer and very well-known musical critic. So she sort of prepared the Russian public for Wagner. And then you just mentioned Parsifal, but maybe it's worth noting that stage designer and costumes designer of Parsifal, first Parsifal, was a Russian man, Pavel Zhukovsky, a friend of Wagner, who lived in Bayreuth nearby him. And that Zhukovsky, he spent the last 5 months of Wagner's life together with Richard and Cosima in Venice. So the bonds were there. One may say Wagner earned the biggest fee in his life in the Russian Empire in St. Petersburg during his tour in 1863. And he loved it so much that he even thought about moving permanently to St. Petersburg and stay there and complete his Ring of the Nibelung there. One may recall a period of time when Wagner was close to making a suicide. And it was Grand Duchess Yelena of Russia who helped him to overcome. As you see, there are lots of personal attachment of Wagner to the Russian Empire then. But then his music came in. Then I would say it's an unusual story to explain, because as a writer, I see a huge gap between how the public received Wagner and how music professionals, music critics received Wagner. Do you mind me to elaborate on that a little bit?
Please do. Please continue.
Yeah, because if we talk about public, I need to say first the honeymoon of Wagner with Russia took a long time, really a long time. But even starting from his concerts, his tours back in 1863, houses were fully packed, all tickets sold out. Yeah, people applauded every night. People were even standing at the concert halls. There were no empty seats there. So encores were a regular during these events. So you see, the public liked Wagner. Why they did so? I think that it's not only because of the music or unusual music, or it's not because of Wagner reformed the opera, as everyone said, but that's probably because Wagner's plots are based on timeless myths and legends, which are so close to Russian soul. And Russian people, they did want to have this experience of listening to this music. And they didn't care what the critics said. They simply loved that experience. That's one part of the story. And the other part of the story is that musical critics, they went mad about Wagner. You mentioned that you wanted to hear about the reception of Wagner in Russia, and I found a couple of quotes for you from newspapers of that times in the Russian Empire. Do you mind if I quote
Please.
something to you?
Please go ahead.
Let me start first with the Wagner's tour to Russia. All newspapers were full of caricatures. Wagner conducting on a podium, and in a hall, in the audience, nannies with babies sit. And that was all commented like this is a music of the future by Wagner and its audience. And then critics said, I'll just read it. His imagination is poor. His melody is extremely weak. Let me read another one for you. Wagner clearly has a talent, but it's not straightforward. It grows sideways like a crooked birch tree. An interesting comment by Tchaikovsky when he heard the pieces from Tristan and Isolde at that time. He said, unbearable, soul-draining music, the dullest, endless drudgery. All right, that was at the time of Wagner tour. Let's go a couple of decades afterwards, and Wagner completed the Ring of the Nibelung. One of the Russian composers, Caesar Cui, he did the review of the Ring for the Russian public and published this review in the St. Petersburg Vedomosti, the daily newspaper of the Russian capital. So, and then he said his Wagner's music is like an ugly lady. In the evening time in the theater, with a good makeup and soft theatrical lights, she can impress. But God save me from seeing her in the morning without a makeup. You see? There is a difference there. So critics and these professionals, they really dislike Wagner music. Why so? And I answer this question in a way that we need to go back to the music and opera history of Russia of that time, not necessarily politics. But politics was somehow involved there. So after the war with Napoleon, 1812, the level of patriotism in Russia was too high. And there was a huge demand on national music, on folk music. And everything foreign, not necessarily Germanic, was rejected. So and Mikhail Glinka, he addressed that demand very well. And then he became an icon of the Russian national music, and he's sort of still an icon of the Russian national music. And Wagner simply did not fit that environment. And exactly for that reason, most of famous Russian composers like Tchaikovsky, Rubinstein, the Magic Handful, they did not like and didn't promote Wagner at all, exactly for that reason. But that doesn't mean these composers were not influenced by the music of Wagner. If we take Rimsky-Korsakov with his Invisible City of Kitesh, or we take Mussorgsky with his Boris Godunov, yes, music is completely different from Wagner's one, but these dramatic elements are there, so they couldn't avoid Wagner's influence. And over time, Russia hasn't got much choice. You may know, you may not know, Adam, that in the Russian Empire, there was a tradition that every year, January through March, all the theaters were closed for Lent.
Mm.
So there were no performances there. All the theaters belonged to the government, to the Tsar, and all of them were closed and were rented out to visiting foreign troops. And during these periods of rent out of the theater, some troops from other countries brought Wagner to Russia. Like, take this Angela Neumann, the entrepreneur and the director of the Prague Wagner Theater. Yes, he called himself a Wagner Theater. And he had exclusive rights for the Ring of the Nibelung from Bayreuth. So he brought that to Russia. And public was mad about that. All tickets were sold. People paid crazy money to go for Ring. And Ring was on a stage in St. Petersburg, in the capital of Russia, for 2 months. And then people started demanding this. And the Russian treasury also earned a lot from these tours. They also saw the way of earning money. That's how Russian opera houses started to produce and stage Wagner's operas. And if you look for the period of time until the First World War, then you had all the Russian operas on the stage in the Russian capital. That's how the story developed. Then if I go into politics a little bit, that you mentioned, sorry, if I talk too much, you stop me at any point of time. But that's a very interesting situation if I go to politics of the First World War, because we'll now be talking about a prototype of what is nowadays called the cancel culture. During the World War I, everything German, including music, including Wagner, was boycotted, was banned in the Russian Empire. And once the peace treaty was signed, in a few years, in 3 days, Parsifal was back on the stage. And the demand was so huge among the Russian public that it was on the stage almost daily. It became at that time much more popular than Tchaikovsky operas that are normally number 1 in the list of the mostly performed operas in the Russian Empire and still in Russia. So that tells me that people in Russia, despite this cancel culture of that times, they were missing Wagner. They wanted Wagner to be back. There was a different story after World War II, and the communistic regime in Russia at that time did not incentivize much of the German music. So Wagner was not a regular on the stage after World War II. It just took some time, but Wagner is back on stage. And now, as you asked me a question from the very beginning, which city do I go to see Wagner? If you go to St. Petersburg, you can see all the Wagner at the Mariinsky Theater.
What an incredible wealth of information. Thank you. May I please just a note for information to clarify, you mentioned the treaty during the First World War. Do you mean the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk?
Yes, it's a Brest Peace Treaty of 1918. Yes?
Yes. So just to clarify, this was the separate treaty between the German Empire and the young Soviet Union.
Correct.
And to move back a second, I mean, this is an incredible wealth of information. And before we get to the Soviet Union and the Second World War, would you please elaborate a little bit more on the censorship of Parsifal? You spoke of The Ring and its great success. If we move to Parsifal, Wagner's last work, right, the Temple of Art concept behind it, play for the consecration of the stage, what were some of the unique considerations that were in play for a work of art that used or dramatized religion and religious ritual in such an audacious manner as Parsifal, Wagner's last work?
Well, thanks, Adam. I don't think my story will be any engaging, but in the Russian Empire, there was a set of censorship rules, and what was a censorship charter in the Russian Empire. And one of the rules was you cannot show the religious rite, the Orthodox rite, or on a stage. And that's basically it. And that was the only reason why Parsifal was censored so heavily and almost banned, because censors saw there something close to the Christian right that they couldn't allow to perform on a stage. The interesting story is, as I said, as public of Russia, they like the story. And I spent times in reading lots of documents in the State Archive of Russia relating to correspondence of the censors. And censors helped the stage director to present the story in a way that is okay for the censorship charter. For example, no cross on the stage. Or for example, the blessing of bread and wine was divided. Bread and wine was in a part of one part of the stage, and blessing took place in the other part of the stage. That sounds very funny, but interestingly, that even the bureaucrats, the censors, they did this for the Russian public to see Parsifal at the end of the day.
It's so fascinating because there was a strong resistance, as you mentioned, to something like religious heresy or desacralization because of the issue of the communion on stage. And I just wonder about Wagner's use of religion and myth as opposed to what was common on Russian stages, and even the larger difference. Like if we take a step back, and you charted incredibly insightfully how Wagner had these incredibly close personal ties, biographic ties with many Russian personalities. And on the other hand, many composers, leading composers, Tchaikovsky you mentioned, and if we go a little bit later, Stravinsky, who declared himself, right, the antichrist to Wagner, and who in many ways kind of mocked Wagner's whole system of the total work of art and the leitmotifs. And Wagner relies culturally on a whole different set of references. On the one hand, to Catholicism, as we've been mentioning with Parsifal, and the idea of the crusade behind it, as well as this kind of like Catholic, Celtic, Western, romantic, Arthurian legend in Tristan, and also
Yeah.
Parsifal. So I'm wondering, there seems to be a paradox here that Wagner, on the one hand, had incredibly close ties with many elements of late Russian imperial life, and yet he cultivated a, at base, very Germanic, romantic nationalism that seemed to be at odds with the entire Russian cultural and religious world. How do you explain this seeming tension there?
Adam, I don't think that in Russia people saw Wagner's masterpieces as Germanic. In Russia, there was a clear view. Let's take the last masterpieces. For example, Tristan. It's a tale about war between England and Ireland. If you take The Ring, it's Scandinavian myths. If you take Parsifal, it's a French story. Yes, probably you can say Mastersingers, they are sort of Germanic, but Wagner himself created Mastersingers as a comedy. So surprisingly, but at those times, when we discuss the censorship of Parsifal or whatsoever, no one ever thought about this Germanic influence of Wagner in Russia. I think Russian story was not about that. That you mentioned, for example, Tchaikovsky, and if I recall, I read the Tchaikovsky memoirs about Wagner. What he was against the Wagnerism, for people treating Wagner's oeuvres as sort of a musical religion, and he was sort of against the structure of Wagner's operas. Tchaikovsky was a composer who believe the first and the most important in the opera is a melody. It's a nice melody. Can I give you a story that's been recorded? Then Tchaikovsky heard Tristan and Isolde first time, the fragments. That was in 1863 during the Wagner tour. Tchaikovsky was a student of the conservatorium. He was 25 years old. And his friend Herman Laroche, he recorded the saying by Tchaikovsky after that. Tchaikovsky said, who the hell writes about love and death, about day and night like this? Let me grow up and let me show to the world how to explain in music the day and the night. And at the end of the day, he created Iolanta. It's a nice opera. It's a lovely opera. I like it. But if I want to go to the opera house and experience a feeling of suffering, I'll probably go to Tristan, not to Iolanta.
Mm.
So somehow, maybe Adam, much more background for that. But my recollection, there was nothing political around that. It was all about musical tastes. It was all about the vision of Russian composers, how to develop the opera as a part of the culture in the future. And when we talk about censorship or whatever, just strict rules. You won't believe them. Just strict rules. One of the rules was you can't show the Tsar on the stage.
Mm.
Yeah, nothing to do with politics. Just you can't do that, and that's it. And therefore, if you remember that in a couple of operas, they show Catherine II. That was a big problem for the stage directors how to do it. They normally had a lady turning back to the public, so they see the silhouette of the Catherine, but they don't see the face.
Mm. It's fascinating retaining a strict boundary between the sacred and the theatrical in the Russian world. Also, considering you just mentioned the prohibition on the depiction of the Tsar on stage,
Yeah,
that the Tsar, even though the emperor had no status within the church hierarchy, he was still allowed to enter behind the iconostasis in a church into the sacred precinct.
yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly.
Uh,
If we strangely, if you talk about Parsifal, that both Tsar Nicholas was at the performance of Parsifal in St. Petersburg, and the how we call chief prosecutor of the Holy Synod was
mm,
there. They both liked it.
mm,
So
mm,
the censorship charter is a censorship charter, but these two people both liked it. The mother of the Tsar Nicholas, she noted in her diary that there was a huge dinner after the performance at the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, and all of them were there. The Tsar family, all the noble families of St. Petersburg, the members of the first Russian Parliament Duma, the ambassadors, the ministers, and the representatives of the church. And she said everyone praised Parsifal. So
mm,
rules are the rules, but doesn't necessarily they were so strict in their enforcement.
mm. Fascinating. Um, Maybe we can return to your brilliant narrative and storytelling of Russian history and Wagner. If we get to the Second World War, and now we talk about the Soviet Union, which completely turned upside down, right? Almost everything in Russian culture and society. And of course, the horrible Nazi invasion. And in the West, there is the strong identification of Hitler and Wagner, even though the West, especially the English world, was never directly invaded by the Nazis. So I'm wondering if you could explain more about the whole experience of the Second World War and the Soviet Union and Wagner.
Adam, I would be very honest with you. I'm not a historian. I probably can't speak very confident about the implications. But what I know as a researcher and as a writer, in the Russian Empire, sorry, in the USSR, after the World War II, association between Nazis and Wagner were very, very seldom.
Mm.
And if you look at the research works of musicologists, they simply said, analyzing this statement, Monsieur Wagner died well before Hitler was born.
Mm.
Yeah, as simple as that. So you could find speculations in the press or whatsoever, but in the scientific world, of those people who studied Wagner, there was no direct link in the Russian reception of the situation between Wagner and his music and Nazis. It was more of a general reception of Germany after the war as a nation, a hostile nation to the Soviet Union. And Wagner was sort of a part of a German heritage, of a German culture. It was nothing Wagner specific, just all the German stuff.
Do you think that's fascinating? Do you think it's so different from the Anglo world in terms of interpreting what went wrong in German history? And do you think that it perhaps had something to do with the fact that the GDR, East Germany, was in the Soviet orbit, and therefore, in addition to that, that the Soviet terminology always spoke of fascism rather than, let's say, German nationalism or Prussianism, as was heard in the West. So they deliberately didn't seek to stigmatize German or Germany culturally.
I don't know, Adam. I'm not a subject matter expert here. So better ask Russian historians about that.
Mm.
I don't know.
But it's fascinating what you confirm, that even researchers or in the public in general, that Wagner wasn't seen as stigmatized or corrupted via the association with the Nazi party or with Hitler.
Because Wagner has died before this
Mm.
party emerged and before Hitler was born.
Mm.
People like to interpret the history in the way they like.
Mm.
People like to use speculations, but let's be very clear on that. Wagner has nothing to do with it, really.
Mm. Mm. So if we can take that even to your personal reminiscences, and it would be fascinating if you could share, because you lived through this tumultuous transition with the disintegration of the Soviet Union into the years of the 90s, where there was tremendous suffering socially and economically for the population. And I think the listeners would be served by any memories you could share. And I wonder, in that transition, how it affected you. How do you think that musically, how did it change what you were exposed to? Do you think that it influenced your openness to Wagner? I know this is counterfactual, but let's say the Soviet Union had never collapsed. Do you think you would have as much of an enthusiasm for Wagner as you do now?
Oh, listen, Adam, I think there are so many questions in what you ask. Let me start with recollection of my memories. I think for me it went very quickly because I was a university student and time passed very quickly. And it was sort of a dramatic from the very beginning, but not that dramatic at the end, because the Russian economy started to pick up after the collapse of Soviet Union quite quickly. So we experienced bad times, let's say 92, 93. In 98, there was already economic growth in the country. So 5 years is not that long in the history of Russia. But when you asked me about Wagner there, let me recall something, Adam. I think Beethoven was in the Philharmonic halls of St. Petersburg, at least, all the time. It has never disappeared. Beethoven was there. Wagner was still in the Mariinsky Theater, Kirov Theater at that time, the Opera House, but I think there were only a few pieces there. Like I remember Lohengrin from my childhood. It was there. And I think a Flying Dutchman was there, or Valkyrie was there. So Wagner was there, probably not performed that often. And in a way, even in the Soviet culture, those who wanted to learn the German music, including Wagner's music, they had the opportunity of doing so. Um, as I said, I'm not a musicologist, but I read somewhere that in the Soviet times, before I was born, there were so many tours of foreign troops, of foreign theaters to the USSR, to Moscow and St. Petersburg. They brought Wagner there. So the public knew about that. There were lots of recordings of Wagner operas on vinyl, and I still keep them at home. They were made at the time of the Soviet Union. So if Soviet Union, I couldn't believe it, but if Soviet Union was not collapsed, I think we would still have in Russia Wagner on stage. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know how the country would develop if the Soviet Union continues to be there, but the country had no choice rather than to continue interaction of different cultures and communication with the rest of the world. Maybe we'll have the same Wagnerian state of the Russian theaters that we have now. Maybe not, but I don't think it could change for worse. Sorry, I'm too talkative. I'm just thinking aloud. I'm thinking aloud. Is there anything specific you would like to ask me more about that?
We continue. You were just mentioning Beethoven being performed and that you had seen Lohengrin in your youth at the Modinsky and some memories from the 90s. So perhaps we could pick up there.
Yeah, thank you, Adam, because we were discussing hypothetical situation with you. What would happen if Soviet Union would not collapse, and how would this affect Wagnerism in Russia? And I said for me it's very hard to predict what would happen. And I was giving you a couple of examples. Then Wagner was on the stage in Russia that you could listen to Wagner at the Philharmonic Hall, the music universities and conservatories of Russia. People studied Wagner there. There were books issued in the Soviet times about Wagner, his life, his works. So the scientific research never stopped. So, and what I said with again, how I viewed that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were much more interactions between Russia and the other countries. So we could see more Wagner coming in. If that hasn't happened, we don't know. Really don't know. Very hard to say. But we wouldn't lose Wagner for sure. The question would be whether we would have enough Wagner or not.
Does any Russian composer come close to Wagner for you personally? And then also in the more public role, is there any Russian composer that you would maybe compare with Wagner in the first instance?
No, not at all. I like lots of Russian composers, but I like them differently, and they are different. But probably I could say, I hope, Adam, you heard of Alexander Borodin,
Yes.
who created the Prince Igor, yeah?
Yes.
And that's also one of my favorite operas, the Prince Igor. There is no direct link between Borodin and Wagner, and the music of Borodin is unlike the music of Wagner. But if you look at the story of this opera, Prince Igor, Borodin was, I think he was a scientist, he was a chemist, he was a professor in chemistry, and he composed music. Then he was on a sick leave. Sorry, I just allow myself a short joke. I remember this from music school. That normally when you have good wishes to someone on Christmas or birthday or New Year, you basically wish to a person a good health. So all the friends wished to Borodin to stay as much as possible on the sick leave to complete the Prince Igor plot at the end of the day. So he spent 19 years on that, and he hasn't completed the plot. Rimsky-Korsakov, I think, and Glazunov, they completed the opera for him. But that's a long piece of work, like Wagner worked on a Ring, so Borodin worked on Prince Igor. It's based on a myth. It's based on the tale of the campaign of Prince Igor in the 12th century. And that time was Rus, the historic Russia. And so that was the campaign against Polovtsians on the Don River. It's sort of two cultures faced each other, the Russian culture and the Eastern culture. That's sort of an interesting in a way that adds a dramatic element to this entire plot. But if why I was thinking about this opera, just because of the myth, because of this dramatic element, the two cultures they struggled, and the issues addressed in this opera, there are so many of them, and that's comparable to the number of issues that Wagner raises in his masterpieces. But what's different is probably that plot can help understanding what is called Russian soul, what that really means. The opera will talk about the duty, about dignity, about love to own country, defense of the own country, about geopolitics and tricks of geopolitics, about threat of attack, about even respect to the enemy, love story, of course, and all of this will be presented by the mixture of traditional large Russian culture and the Eastern culture. Very interesting plot by Borodin. I would say not Wagner, of course, but comparable.
That's fascinating. And the moment you mentioned Borodin, what came to mind immediately was his symphonic work on the steppes of Central Asia, which musically enacts something akin to the plot of Prince Igor, like namely the confrontation of East versus West, of Slavic versus Turkic or Tatar. And it's kind of a navigation of hybridity. And what I think is so distinct, and the Russian national school of composers you mentioned, the Mighty Handful or the Mighty Five, they often aim to kind of integrate this quote Oriental component of Russian cultural identity, whether it was Islamic or Turkic or Tatar. And it seems interesting that for Wagner, the Oriental component was really the fantastical. It was the mythic that, let's say, distinct from both Russia and even France. And let's remember that Russia's main ally in Europe at the time was France.
Yep.
And there's a tremendously strong Oriental component and colonialist component to French culture at the time. But Wagner and the German rarely engaged to the same extent, at least musically. Like very few German composers integrated Oriental themes. Let's say at the furthest reach might be Brahms' Hungarian dances, like some of the more, let's say, gypsy oriented.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
That seems to be distinctive, but that's a very helpful comparison with Borodin in particular. I thought maybe you could share a bit, because you've done some fascinating work recently in several interesting European cities outside of Russia. As much as you feel you would like to share, I think it would be wonderful to hear about like what brought you to which places, what have you discovered there, how does the culture differ, how has it impacted on your work on Wagner and your understanding more generally.
Adam, thanks for asking. I don't think there's much interest in my personal story here, but if I take my last 4 years of my life, I spent them in Krakow and in Belgrade, where I live and work now. Surprisingly, in Poland and in Serbia, There is not much Wagner on stage. People don't know this music, really. No Wagner in opera houses, no Wagner in philharmonic halls. That's fascinating. That's interesting. And that's why, and you asked me, how does that impact my Wagnerian efforts? I'm trying to organize musical evenings and literary evenings devoted to Wagner. Just meet young pianists, meet heavy pianists with a track of records and lots of wins in international competitions, meet the professional environment like musicologists, professors at local conservatories and music faculties at the university, and organize these events for the public, trying to introduce this music to the public in the countries I happen to be.
Do you think, is there something that they are missing about Wagner, or something that is not misunderstood? Or are there any assumptions that you've encountered, let's say in Krakow or Belgrade? Or how might you also just explain the absence of Wagner, considering that I think, they both have great opera houses and pretty lively musical scenes?
I think it doesn't depend much on the country, Adam. If you allow me, I can only talk not from own experience. Let me talk from own experience, not from what I read or from what I hear. Experience of meeting with my readers, experience of people who come to my music events. I think there are people who are simply afraid of Wagner. They're really afraid of Wagner so much that they don't know the music and they don't want to know the music. And talking afraid, what does afraid mean? Nothing changed for centuries. People believe the music is too long. It is too loud, too boring, too complicated, too exhaustive. You remember Oscar's Wilde saying, poor people who came to the opera house for Wagner, sit there for an hour, for a second hour, get bored, look at their watches and realize that only 20 minutes have passed. That sort of the stereotypes, they still live in people, but I think I found my way talking to my audiences how to change the stereotypes. I don't think my recipes are simple, but they're workable. First, what I suggest to people who are afraid of going for Wagner to the opera house or the philharmonic hall, or to travel somewhere, especially for Wagner, or to watch a recording, or to watch a live stream, or to buy a record of an opera, I just say to people, why don't you invest a little bit of more time, if you are prepared to, if you want to get yourself prepared for that music. Understand a bit more the plot behind that, the story behind that, and set your mind not to aesthetic entertainment, but more for for an interesting exercise for your brain to work heavily for as long as this music lasts, or even longer. That's my suggestion number one. And as you somehow recall this other saying by Mark Twain, he said you can't fall in love with Wagner. I think he said immediately. You have to systematically learn to love him. So preparation is a key here, but it's a good time investment. It's a good learning experience. And the other thing, as I discuss with people, what can help is, why don't we all start thinking about Wagner as an icon, as a monument, as a reformer of the opera? Let's think of him as a human being. Yeah, a human being who wanted to talk to us, to his generation, to our generation, to the future generations. Yes, he did want to talk to us in a specific language, in a specific musical language, but he wanted to talk to us about the matters that are important for us, like what is good, what is bad, what is God, what is evil, what is right, what is wrong. What issues does our society have? What issues does our world have? Our planet have? Yeah, I can continue that what the human being really is, what is the, you know, essence of a human being, the self-awareness, self-knowledge, self-sacrifice, even redemption. I'm sorry. And studying Wagner's life, I know it took him time to succeed putting this message across. And he wasn't perfect. He wasn't perfect as a composer. He wasn't perfect as an individual. He had his own weaknesses, but at least he tried. And my firm view is that Wagner, at the end of the day, was this romantic optimist. He did believe that he could make our world at least a little bit better than it is. And knowing that, not that simple, but knowing that, we can overcome all of these stereotypes and perceptions and myths that exist around Wagner and prevent people from learning Wagner and listening to Wagner.
It's fascinating to frame him that way as a kind of almost Buddhist, like self-help figure, one of the last romantics. And I think quite contrary to this view that politicizes him as the object of cancel culture and as a racist ultra nationalist. It's a fascinating view because I do think that there's a whole mental health component at work, and something almost akin, as I think you mentioned, in terms of time and preparation, almost like a kind of hypnosis session, that it requires like a different level of concentration that is increasingly so elusive for most people today.
Interesting, Adam. Interesting.
Yes. Yes. No, I so appreciate your time and your efforts, and I thank you very much, Slava.
Thank you, Adam.
I wish you all the very best. And once again, it's a tremendous amount to think about. And please share any of your current works. And I would like to post some things on the site, including your work about Wagner and drinks, if that's okay.
Yeah, let's go for Wagner and drinks. Let's for your audience, for your subscribers, let's let them feel Wagner a little bit more human and less politician, because it's Adam, I heard with interest what you said. It's not the first time I hear that. It's always when someone is so great in a culture of a particular nation or a country, then you associate all the good about this culture and all the evil about this culture, or about this country, sorry, with all the greatest people that represent this culture. And I think Wagner is not an exception here.
That about does it for us. We hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you for tuning in, our dear listeners. Please remember to rate and review and to like and subscribe to Music and Politics, the only show on the internet that combines musical grooves with philosophical insights from all around the world. Please do send any questions, thoughts, comments, and suggestions to musicandpoliticspod@gmail.com. That's one word lowercase, musicandpoliticspod. And please do find us out on Patreon. Again, at Music and Politics Pod, one word lowercase. There you can support us to keep us going to see another day. And in exchange for the cost of an overpriced cup of coffee, we will provide curated readings and playlists from what you have already heard and where you can go next on your own journey into music and politics. Fare thee all so well.